It is a Sunday morning in August 1971. A young college student is sitting at home when a police car pulls up outside. Officers get out, knock on his door, and place him under arrest in full view of his neighbors for armed robbery and burglary. He is handcuffed, read his rights, put in the back of the car, and driven to the local police station, where he is booked, fingerprinted, and blindfolded. He is then driven to a basement, not a real prison, a basement beneath the psychology department at Stanford University, where the hallway has been converted into a mock cell block with bars on the doors and buckets in the corners. He is stripped, given a smock with a number on it, a chain bolted to his ankle, a stocking cap pulled over his hair. His name is gone. He is now prisoner 8612. Standing on the other side of those bars, in a khaki uniform and mirrored sunglasses, is someone he might have passed on campus last week. A fellow student, a regular person, a volunteer just like him, but today that person is a guard. And what happens over the next 6 days will become one of the most debated, disturbing, and consequential experiments in the history of psychology. Not because of what the researchers discovered about human nature, but because of what they failed to stop. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. We have already watched ordinary people administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks because a scientist told them to. We watched nurses nearly overdose patients on the instruction of a voice on the phone. We watched high school students build a functioning fascist movement in 5 days. Each of those experiments asked a version of the same question. How much does authority shape our behavior? The Stanford prison experiment takes that question and pushes it somewhere darker. It doesn't ask what we do when authority tells us to harm someone. It asks what we become when authority gives us permission to be someone else entirely. The answer is something very few people are prepared to hear. The year is 1971. Philip Zimbardo is a professor of psychology at Stanford University, smart, ambitious, and deeply interested in the same territory Milgram had mapped a decade earlier, the psychology of situational power. The question of whether character is fixed, or whether it bends under the weight of context and role. Zimbardo wanted to understand prisons, not just as physical institutions, but as psychological ones. What does it do to a person to be stripped of their identity and placed in a position of total powerlessness? And conversely, what does it do to a person to be handed power over others with virtually no accountability? He designed an experiment to find out. And unlike Milgram's laboratory setting or Hoffling's hospital ward, Zimbardo went all the way. He didn't simulate authority. He simulated an entire world. Zimbardo recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper advertisement, offering $15 a day to participate in a 2-week study of prison life. All applicants were screened for psychological stability, criminal history, and physical health. The final 24 were, by every available measure, ordinary, healthy, well-adjusted young men. They were randomly assigned to one of 2 roles, prisoner or guard. Random, a coin flip. The difference between who would spend the next 2 weeks with a chain on their ankle and who would spend it with a baton in their hand came down to nothing more than chance. The basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall was transformed. 3 cells, each holding 3 prisoners. A solitary confinement closet, a guard station, a yard. Zimbardo himself took on the role of prison superintendent. The Sunday morning arrests were coordinated with the Palo Alto Police Department. Real officers, real handcuffs, real neighbors watching, to ensure that the psychological transition from student to prisoner began before the participants even arrived at the experiment. By the time they reached that basement, the experience of being arrested had already begun to shift something in their minds. The guards were given no specific instructions on how to behave. They were simply told to maintain order and that physical violence was prohibited. Everything else was left to them. Everything else left to them. In the first hours, the guards were self-conscious, almost awkward. They weren't sure what the role required of them. They moved carefully, spoke stiffly, seemed uncertain how much of themselves to put into the performance. That uncertainty didn't last long. By the second day, the guards had found their footing, and what they found was deeply troubling. They began waking prisoners at 2 a.m. for arbitrary head counts. They forced prisoners to do push-ups for minor infractions. They confiscated mattresses, making prisoners sleep on concrete floors. They made prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. They gave certain prisoners special privileges, better food, better conditions, and then rotated those privileges unpredictably to generate distrust and division among the prisoner group. The mirrored sunglasses, it turned out, were not an accident. Zimbardo had provided them specifically because he had read research suggesting that anonymity increases aggressive behavior. When a guard cannot be seen, when their eyes are hidden behind a reflective surface, They stop feeling individually responsible for their actions. They become the role, not the person. The prisoners responded to the escalating pressure in ways that were startling in their speed and depth. Some became passive, withdrawn, robotic, speaking only when addressed, shuffling rather than walking, losing the energy and personality their friends would have recognized in them. Others broke down. On the morning of the second day, prisoner 8612, the first student arrested, the one we met at the beginning of this story, began to cry uncontrollably, to rage, to disintegrate. He was screaming. He was showing signs of acute psychological crisis. The researchers initially assumed he was faking it, trying to get out early. They brought him back to his cell. He was not faking it. He had to be released from the study. Over the following days, 4 more prisoners had to be released due to severe emotional distress. One broke out in a full-body stress rash. Another went on hunger strike. The guards responded to the hunger strike by forcing food on him, then placing him in solitary confinement and telling the other prisoners that he was a troublemaker and that they could have their mattresses back, but only if they agreed to leave him in isolation. The prisoners chose the mattresses. That moment, ordinary young men choosing their own comfort over the suffering of a fellow prisoner, is perhaps the quietest and most devastating finding in the entire study. Here is what makes the Stanford prison experiment unique among all the studies in this series. In every other experiment we have discussed, there was a researcher watching from outside the situation, observing, recording, maintaining at least a minimal ethical distance from what was unfolding. At Stanford, the researcher went inside. Zimbardo did not observe the experiment. He ran it. He inhabited the role of prison superintendent with a completeness that, in retrospect, alarms him more than anything else about the study. When a colleague, Christina Masloch, who later became his wife, visited the prison on the 5th day and watched a line of prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads, she was horrified. She turned to Zimbardo and said, "What you are doing to those boys is terrible." And Zimbardo's first reaction was not concern. It was irritation. He was annoyed that she was disrupting the study. He felt in that moment like a superintendent defending his institution, not like a psychologist responsible for the welfare of his participants. It was Masloch's reaction, her absolute refusal to normalize what she was seeing, that finally broke the spell. Zimbardo shut the experiment down the next morning, 6 days into what was planned as a 2-week study. He has spent much of his subsequent career trying to understand and explain how a decent, intelligent, ethically trained researcher could become so absorbed in a role that he lost the perspective to see what was right in front of him. His answer, which he developed into a theory he called the Lucifer effect, is both unsettling and important. The same situational forces that transformed his student volunteers into abusive guards also transformed him. No one in that basement was immune. The Stanford prison experiment became one of the most famous studies in the history of psychology, and later one of the most vigorously criticized. On the ethical side, the criticism is clear and largely unanswerable. Participants suffered genuine psychological harm. Their distress was initially dismissed as performance. The experiment had no meaningful independent oversight. The line between research and abuse was crossed, and the person who should have been watching for that line had become part of the problem. But the scientific criticisms go further. In 2018, a researcher named Ben Bloom published an exposé based on previously unheard audio recordings from the study. The recordings suggested that guards had been coached by Zimbardo's assistant to behave harshly, that the most dramatic behaviors had been performed by very few individuals, not the majority, that the narrative of universal situational collapse had been significantly overstated in the way Zimbardo presented his findings to the world. Zimbardo disputed some of these claims. Others have defended the study's core insights while acknowledging its methodological flaws. The debate continues. What we can say with confidence is this: some of the guards did become cruel. Some of the prisoners did genuinely collapse. The experiment did have to be stopped, and Zimbardo himself did lose his ethical footing inside his own study. Whatever the precise scientific conclusions, those are not performances. Those are facts. The Stanford prison experiment at its heart is a story about the power of roles, about what happens when a costume becomes a character, when a title becomes a permission slip, when a situation provides a ready-made script for behavior that the person inside it would never have chosen freely. We all inhabit roles: parent, employee, manager, customer, citizen. And most of the time, those roles serve us well. They provide structure, expectation, a shared language for how to move through the world together. But the Stanford basement asks us to look carefully at what our roles are asking of us. whether they are expanding our humanity or slowly contracting it. The guards who behaved most cruelly in that basement were not cruel people. Several of them, in follow-up interviews, expressed deep remorse about what they had done. They had not known, going in, what they were capable of. The uniform and the sunglasses and the title had done something to them that they had not consented to and had not anticipated. Knowing that is not an excuse. It is a responsibility. If a role can bring out the worst in ordinary people without their awareness, then awareness itself becomes one of our most important moral tools. Ask yourself regularly and honestly, is this role making me more human or less? Am I acting from my values or from the script the situation has handed me? The guard with the mirrored sunglasses could not see his own eyes. That, in the end, may be the most important detail in the entire experiment. Philip Zimbardo shut down the Stanford prison experiment on August 20th, 1971, 6 days after it began. He later said that the hardest thing about the experience was not what the guards did or what the prisoners endured. It was recognizing what it had done to him. That recognition, painful, humbling, and hard-won, is the gift the experiment left behind. Not a clean scientific finding, but a deeply human lesson that no one is above the situation. That awareness is not a given. It must be actively, continuously, deliberately maintained. Next time, we stay inside the theme of institutional power, but we shift our gaze from the prison to the psychiatric hospital. 8 perfectly sane people walk through the doors of 12 different mental institutions across America. They behave completely normally, and not one of them is believed. That is the Rosenhan experiment, and it will change the way you think about diagnosis, about labels, and about who gets to decide what sanity looks like. If this episode made you think differently about the roles you play in your own life, I want to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss a single experiment in this series. We are only going deeper from here. I'll see you in the next one.